I'm assuming you're all here because you're interested in English language learners. And I'm assuming that you have at least a basic understanding of universal design for learning. If not, stop me at any point in time. I'm going to move with that assumption. I know that the keynote, Paula Kluth actually introduced the concept a little bit, so hopefully that will be enough for us to move quickly through this. We only have 75 minutes, so we're going to move quickly. Okay? Here we go. I like to start with goals and outcomes. I think that it's important for our learners and for you as learners to know why you're participating in any kind of learning environment, what it is that you're expected to do. So I always start with goals. And this is the learner outcome that I've thought about would be appropriate for this particular session. That's how I'm focusing the material that we're going to be addressing. But the other piece that's really important is that you also have an opportunity to think about your personal learning goal for this session. I think that's also important for students, frankly. And I want you to think about what you want to get out of this session. We're going to be talking about how UDL applies to lessons and supports for English learners in our classrooms. But what do you want to be able to know or be able to do by the end of this session? And just think about that for about 30 seconds and then share it with someone at your table so that you're making a commitment to it. All right? Go ahead. You write it down. That's a good way to remember. Okay, we're going to keep moving and actually get into culturally responsive teaching. How many of you feel that you're pretty familiar with the principles of culturally responsive teaching? Okay, good. Do you teach in a bilingual environment or a... Okay, all right, great. Culturally responsive teaching is something that many people have defined, and you read one author and you'll find a set of principles. You read another author, you'll find another set of principles. When Louis Lord Nelson and I, who is actually from Indiana, she lives here in Indianapolis, when we wrote this book, Culturally Responsive Design, we decided to go to the most recent source for analyzing and thinking about the principles of culturally responsive teaching, and that was Brown University. And what they've done is they've actually looked at all of the different sets of principles that are out there, and they've combined them into these 7. And so we do talk about these 7 culturally responsive teaching principles in the book. I'll just review them very quickly for you and with you. Positive perspectives on parents and families, obviously. That you certainly want that. One of the things that's important about that particular principle is that you assume that the student's parents are interested, rather than assuming that they're not. Oftentimes they have multiple jobs and difficulty with language barriers and whatnot, so they may not appear to be as interested. But research has actually shown that parents of kids who are culturally diverse and English learners are just as interested. They do just the same kinds of things as any other population of parents with other kinds of backgrounds. So assuming that they're interested makes a difference in terms of how you organize your outreach to them and your community experiences. Communication of high expectations. A lot of times people will lower their expectations when they have kids in their classrooms that are struggling, whether those kids be students with disabilities, English learners, kids from poverty, whatever it might be. But frankly, what they've found is that kids who are expected to do less, do less. And they don't make the kind of progress that you would want. So frankly, what we suggest and what they suggest in the principle is that you not lower your expectations. You keep the same expectations, but you raise your support. You raise your scaffolds for those students so that they can be successful. The other one, learning within the context of culture. We all are involved in cultures. We all have cultural impact on us. We'll be talking about that quite a bit. And And frankly, we have to recognize that our culture and the students' culture have commonalities and differences. And as much as we can learn about their culture and where they're coming from, where their parents have come from, it's a better way that we can actually address their needs, learning about what's a good thing to do and what's not a good thing to do in their culture. And we'll talk about that a bit. So we're always learning within a culture, within the context of culture. Context is extremely important within the learning environment. Student-centered instruction with Universal Design for Learning is all about making sure your instruction is focused on the needs of students. So that's kind of a simple one. Culturally mediated instruction really means that you infuse cultural choices within the choices that you offer to students, that you are careful and mindful about biased choices you might make. For example, if you're giving kids an assignment to write about how Tom Sawyer felt when he was growing up and thinking about the river. If you give the students an assignment where you want them to think about the fact that Tom Sawyer's walking through a museum and he's seeing all of these pictures and exhibits around the river, and how would he feel about that? And what would be his reaction? This is actually a real assignment that somebody I know gave. Well, if the kids have never been to a museum, you know, whether they're English learners or not, then that kind of assignment is really biased. It privileges the kids who have been to museums. You know, my daughter was going to museums when she was 3 years old. And those kids who have never been to a museum have no idea of how to respond to that. And they are in an unprivileged situation. So thinking about the kind of unconscious bias that we put into the work that we provide in the assignments in particular. Reshaping the curriculum so that it better meets the students' needs and is culturally infused. And frankly, having teachers serve as facilitators as opposed to being direct instructors and the only ones who can give information to students, that there's actually a way for them, and Universal Design for Learning is all about this, for them to increase their own knowledge. Are you Park State? Did you have Park assessments? No. It would have been the other one, and I can't remember the name of it. Some of the national standardized tests that were developed based on the Common Core were more flexible. Students could change, you know, how they viewed the test and whatnot, but they weren't any more culturally responsive than tests that had been given in the past. And a lot of times, standardized tests, you really have to look at the norming population that they've used, because if it hasn't been normed on the population that you're teaching, it's invalid to give to your students. And you should really lower the importance of that score and use more objectives, kind of summative assessments that are really more appropriate and valid for kids who are taking a standardized test and don't have the same white privileged background as some of our other kids. But that's a good question, thank you. I don't prefer standardized assessments, frankly. I think we can get a lot better information when we do things like rubrics and formative assessments and projects and, you know, all kinds of case-based learning, those kinds of things. In fact, I teach for George Washington University now, and I don't give any tests. And I'm sure the students love it, but, you know, I don't give tests. I give assignments, projects, collaborative projects, some writing assignments, and they're all based on rubrics. And I've never had to have an argument with a student over their grade, because the rubric tells them exactly what they're going to get. And I do tell them, you know, you choose. You know, you do these things, you get this grade. You do these things, you get that grade. It's up to you. and I've never had to worry about it. So I do highly recommend using rubrics. Let's talk a little bit about universal design for learning, okay? Love this little fella. Fist to 5, how do you feel your knowledge base is around UDL? It'll give me an idea how deep I have to go. 0 being, you know, I don't know anything, and 5 being I teach about it. Okay, all right, good, good, good. We're all within the 2 to 4 range. That's great. So this will be very quick, and you did hear some of it this morning. You know that there are 3 principles associated with universal design for learning, and they're all associated with networks within our brains, neural pathways that are important for learning. And that UDL was originally developed by folks at CAST in the Boston area, Wakefield, Massachusetts, by primarily David Rose and Ann Meyer, that they developed it in response to the fact that they found they were always giving out reports that were focused on changing students, and instead we really can't change students. We need to change our instruction, we need to change our learning environments. That's really what we need to focus on. And so they looked at the neuroscience that was available and continued to do that, and designed the what, the how, the why of learning, the 3 principles. The recognition networks are associated with the principle of multiple means of representation. Let me go to the next one. That would be here. The affective networks, which are in that green section, the center of your brain, are addressed by the principle of multiple means of engagement, and the strategic networks, which are in the front of your brain that really control planning and strategic thinking, are addressed by the principle of multiple means of action and expression. And these are the guidelines. You have copies. We're going to use those throughout the session. Have you seen these before? No? Okay, some yes, some no. One thing that people usually miss about the UDL guidelines is that not only are they structured vertically, but they're also structured horizontally. And this was a big aha for me when I first went to work at CAST. I didn't realize this. But once it was explained to me, it made perfect sense. The ones along the bottom are all about accessing information. Okay, but very simple. How do you perceive the information? How do you support students who need extra assistance in perceiving information? How do you recruit their interest? And how do you make sure that they can physically act on the materials or the information that you're making available? The ones in the middle are about building skills. After you access the information, well, how do you use that access to build knowledge and skills? And you can see thereby, you know, not only are you recruiting their interest, but you're sustaining their effort when you're building skills, and so are they. How you build vocabulary and understanding of symbols, and how you build capability of expressing yourself and communicating with others. And then finally, the top row, which some people call the expert learners row, is really about internalizing the skills that you've built at this level, below, so that you can generalize them and use them in multiple situations. So you're being able to use your skills and regulate your own learning. You're able to not just understand, but actually comprehend to such a deep level that you can transfer the information from mathematics class to science class. You understand it that well. And for action and expression, you not only can express yourself, but you can logically plan how you're going to, and strategize around how you're going to express your opinions and show other people what you know. So that's sort of how the UDL guidelines are organized, and I think it's helpful to know that as you're planning. If you are primarily interested in access, well, then you're going to focus on the guidelines here at the bottom. By the way, the guidelines are the bolded language, for those who might not know, and the black language are really just checkpoints underneath. They're not fully complete. These aren't the only things that you could do, but they are some suggestions. And the principles are up there. So you got principles, guidelines, and checkpoints. Okay. What I've done here, and you could do this on your own copy if you want, is I've taken a look at the guidelines and really thought about English learners and which guidelines are most helpful for them in your instruction. The ones that, if you want to just start with one, I would suggest that in particular, you look at representation, the guidelines under representation. You think about providing options for expression and communication, including bilingual options for them, or use of their first language. And you think about ways that you can engage them. In the book, we talk a lot about engagement by accessing their prior experiences and their culture, so that that is a welcomed environment for them in your classroom, talking about and reflecting on how their culture might relate to whatever it is, whatever goal you're working on in your lesson. Questions on any of this? I'm moving quickly, but I think you guys are there. All right, what I'd like you to do before we move on to learner variability is to just take about 30 seconds with somebody at the table and mention one thing that I just shared with you or that you already know about UDL that you might think might be helpful with English learners. Just one concept before we move on to the next piece, okay? Let's move on to the concept of learner variability. Have you heard that term before? The whole idea behind the UDL guidelines and why I like them so much is they represent learner variability that exists within any group, including this one. And if you rely on them as a starting point for your planning, you can meet any anticipated or unanticipated barrier, including barriers for English learners. They're based on neurological research, as you know, neuroscience, and they really illustrate how each brain is different. Even twins that have the same experiences, they've shown through research, MRIs, that they actually access different parts of their brain than each other because brains do develop differently. And even though we're all different, that doesn't mean we have to do individualized lesson plans for everybody, frankly. It is systematic. This is based on how humans learn, and it is therefore predictable. And you can proactively plan without even knowing who's going to be in your room. Okay, true or false? What do you think? Linguistic and cultural experiences impact how the affective, the emotional networks in your brain develop for English learners. True or false? True? Okay, great. How about those affective networks? We're thinking about kids recruiting interest. If you're talking about something that's not particularly interesting to them, you'll have them for about 2 seconds, and then they lose interest. You use them for the rest of the session or the rest of the class. You only have about 2 minutes at the beginning of any lesson to really recruit interest, frankly. Sustaining attention is actually a problem for kids who are English learners because it's hard to translate the information. It's a cognitive weight that sometimes we don't realize. And even though they might be pretty proficient at speaking, they really are having to do double duty. They're learning the language, they're learning the cultural rules, and they're learning the academics. So it's actually triple duty when I think about it. And that's a bigger weight on them than it is for other students. So you know what? They may look like they're tired or they're bored because they are. They're tired. It's hard work. And regulating learning, it's all about how they regulate what they're learning as a student. Those are a lot of negative kinds of reactions you might see in a student who's feeling like they have no control over their learning and they're not doing too well. Okay, linguistic and cultural experiences impact how recognition networks develop in English learners. True or false? True. Yes? Yes? Okay. Yes, they do. And when you really think about that, it has, in addition to the fact that they're trying to translate language as they're perceiving and understanding it, we also know that different cultures build up different systems of comprehension. That there are some cultures that actually are deductive in terms of their reasoning and cultures that are the opposite. So sometimes how they comprehend and how they show you that they comprehend might be contrary to what you're expecting them to be able to do. So you have to think about giving them flexibility for whether they come from the outside in or the inside out with any problem that you might be presenting to them. Linguistic and cultural experiences impact the strategic networks. Do you think that's true or false? The planning, the strategic planning, the executive functions, the part of the brain that is engaged in strategically organizing how you're going to act, what you're going to do, what you're going to say. Yes? Absolutely. The strategic networks really do relate to how you're physically going to respond, and there are cultural norms within certain cultures that regulate how they can physically respond. In what kind of grouping can they physically respond? Who they can communicate with, who they can work with, and strategically how they might plan, whether or not they feel they have permission to plan, whether or not they feel they have permission to play games that are competitive. Let me just quickly summarize. English learners are not a homogeneous group. You know, there's all kinds of learner variability within that group, just like any other group. They have very unique histories. If their learning has been interrupted by some kind of war or refugee situation, their learning is going to be thwarted in many ways, and it's something that we need to keep in mind. Even though they may have been in school for 6 years someplace, that doesn't mean they had 6 years of continual education during that time. They could have been very interrupted, and that influences how well they're able to learn in your environment. And English learners are learning English and the cultural rules while they're learning content, so they're always doing at least double or triple duty. Okay, so how do your linguistic and cultural skills impact your learning? I have on the walls here a couple of charts with those, whoops, got to go to the next slide. Just to kind of address the differences that might even be among us here in this room. Number one, relating to I speak only English. It's the only language I've ever attempted to learn. Number two being when by the time I was 18, I had learned another language, but I don't speak it fluently. 3, over here, I learned second language by the time I was 18, and I speak it fluently, at least one other language. And up in the front, I speak more than 2 languages fluently. Choose which one of those relates to you. And I would ask you to, on the Post-its that are on your table, write down one way that you think only one, your linguistic and cultural background actually impacts you as a learner, and then put it on the chart that relates to who you are. An English-only speaker, somebody who, like me, took a language in high school and quickly forgot it. Or you actually do know 2 languages fluently, or you know more than 1, more than 2. Okay, so pick one thing that you think makes a difference, and put it up on the chart. Dorothy and Dolores really commented on the fact that because they do speak at least one other language fluently, they, actually Dorothy speaks 3, they're able to sympathize and understand the kinds of struggles that the English learners have, and both of them were actually English learners in different environments. Dolores was child of migrant workers and learned English as her second language, and Dorothy actually grew up in France and had to learn their language because she was an English speaker, and she had to learn French in school as a sort of a French learner, a second language learner. So, so those kinds of experiences give us some sensitivity to what some of our students might be experiencing. The other thing is that you do understand, as I think it was Jamie said, you do understand a bit about how limited English learners are, even though they have a way of describing or using English, that they've only learned one way. And so they're not as flexible in the language as they would have been had they had more opportunities to learn English. These are 3 cases, Sameh, Lelitsu, and Anna, that I'd like to have you take a peek at, read through, because we're going to talk about them in a minute, but I want you to keep them in mind as we talk about this next piece about language development in English learners and how it proceeds. There are some of you familiar with SIOP and WIDA? Yes, okay. WIDA has, I think it's 6 stages of language development, second language development. I happen to like this one, which is from Hill and Miller, because it's got 5 stages, but it also, and you have this in your handout, it also shows some time elements to how typically English learners might move through the different stages, how long it might take to move from one stage to the next. And they actually have this pre-production silent stage where the students are taking it all in and they're just trying to figure out, but they're pretty reticent to expose themselves as being a non-English speaker and not understanding. Early production, where they're able to use 1, 2-word sentences, and they may have the social language down and be deceiving in social situations because they'll have the social language, but they don't have the content behind some of the academics that we're asking them. That also goes over here to the speech emergence stage, where they're able to communicate with you. They can use more complex sentences, but they're still really needing time to develop the understanding and be comfortable with being fluent in the language. Intermediate language fluency, these kids can oftentimes look like they've got it. And unfortunately, sometimes our ESL programs dismiss them from services at this stage. But they're really not ready. They need more. They need more support because they still don't have the deep comprehension and the fluidity in the language that they need. Finally, advanced language proficiency, those students are really at a point where they're near native, which I would assume, you know, even our dual language speakers in here. Once you were able to do that, you were able to use not only your first language as well as your second or third language to understand content vocabulary and to understand the academics. I thought it was interesting that Dorothy said that she had to learn, when she moved back to the United States, she had to learn English academic language because she had learned the academics in France. And our kids were here in this country, even though they may be very fluent and very good in their native language, their first language, when they're here in this country at high school, perhaps middle school, they're having to learn academics almost all over again because they have to compare the content, the vocabulary. in a way that makes it take more time for them. So let's go back to Samé, Lilitsu, and Anna. Take a moment to read those, if you would, and think about which stage you think they might be at. And then see if you can define a stage for each one of those students. Anybody want to make a guess as to where one of them might be? Go ahead, Adam.
I would say Samay is in, where's that from here? Speech emergent.
Speech emergence, okay.
Lilitsu pre, and then Anna in intermediate.
Okay. I think there's no perfect answer, but I think I agree with you. Samé is still right in here someplace. Lilitsu's getting a little closer to this, and so is Anna, although she's got a lot of the social skills, she's one of those kids that's actually in danger of being dismissed too early because she needs additional content in order to move on. So I think probably your main concern is, all right, I get it. Different stages of language development. How do I actually meet these kids' needs? And a couple of points that I think are helpful is every teacher needs to be a language teacher as well as an academic teacher. That's one of the premises that WIDA puts out, and it's very true. You can't just leave that to a half an hour or an hour session with the ESL teacher every day. That's not going to make it. Every teacher should be developing both, if they've got English learners in their classroom, they should be developing both language as well as academic goals, and addressing those language goals in a supportive way for all the kids, but also focused in a way that will meet the needs of the kids who are English learners. Make sure that learners can articulate the learning goals. That's really important, especially for English learners, that they understand what your expectations are. That will lower the stress in the affective networks and help them to engage if they're really sure about what your expectations are, and that it's actually okay for them not to be able to produce a perfect sentence in your classroom. But if they get the content right, that's your expectation, then they're going to be okay. That they make learning goals personal, like I did at the beginning of this session, giving each student an opportunity to figure out, how does this relate to me? How do I activate my background knowledge in a way that I can actually connect with this class on the Civil War, and maintain high expectations. I said this earlier. Even though the kids have barriers, don't lower your expectations of them. Make sure you raise the scaffolds and the supports that you provide. And here are some of the scaffolds that you can consider. These are culturally responsive kinds of scaffolds. You should have them, I think, in your handout. Having available for those kids who actually can read in their first language, have available to them bilingual dictionaries. There's lots of stuff online now where you can even figure out how to say some of the words that you're presenting to them in their first language. And you can go to websites online and do that. Having bilingual word walls, or if you have anchor charts in your room and you have a number of English learners in the room, pairing their language and English so that they can rely on the content out there and not having everything in English all the time. Allowing them the opportunity to speak with somebody who is a first language peer so that they can work in groups with somebody who speaks their language. They get the content that way. And they can be more comfortable. You get rid of the stress that's being placed on them by their affective networks again. And allowing them the opportunity, and you using culturally based examples and choices in the classroom. In addition to some of those other things that are up there that are, except for the use of their first language, ones that you would use with any students. Realia is real items. That's what that means. You're actually using real items as part of your scaffolds. Here are some examples of how you could write your learning goals so that they are culturally responsive. And as you look at those, you'll see a couple of things. One is a point that I make in my first book, UDL Lesson Planning, is that we need to think about using flexible verbs when we're writing our goals. If we write goals that are using verbs that are constrictive in nature and limit students to only one output, then you create barriers just by the mere fact that you're expecting that from your students. Let me give you an example. This one here, the one in the middle. If the verb, instead of that illustrate, which you can do in multiple ways, you can draw, you could do a pantomime, you could use your augmentative communication device, whatever way you're going to illustrate, you could write. If that was replaced with the word write, that they would write an essay describing how proportional relationships would solve, you immediately, by putting write as the verb, a constrictive verb, you immediately limit the number of students that are going to be able to achieve that goal, because some of the students are not going to be able to write well. They'll struggle with that, particularly our English learners. If you were to change here, instead of recall, and you said that they would state the key details that in a nursery rhyme, well, some kids might recall it, but they might have to point in order to recall the key elements of a nursery rhyme. But if you ask them to state it, those kids who can't speak English well, or are in that stage of not wanting to speak yet, that first stage, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to achieve the goal. Does that make sense? So looking at words like read and write, add, subtract, those are very constricted verbs. They only allow for one outcome. If that's what you're working on, though, if you are working on reading, if you are working on writing, then you have to use those verbs. And in that case, you beef up the kinds of supports that you give, the kinds of scaffolds that you use to help those kids that are going to struggle with that particular skill. But if you don't have to ask them to write or read, if you're looking for something else, then think about using more flexible verbs that will allow them the opportunity to be successful. Another way of addressing language, are you familiar with the, okay, great. Are you familiar with the three-tiered vocabulary learning? Some of you are? Okay. I said earlier, it's important for all learners to address language, and this is one way that you can do it in your lessons. It's actually pretty easy. As you're developing your lesson, you think about Tier 1 words, which are common words, and which students might need some additional assistance with those words, and provide scaffolds for that. Tier 2 words, those are those high frequency words that are like the difference between sad and unhappy. You know, they mean the same thing. Student might only know sad. So being able to do some similarities and differences for them to help them contrast vocabulary in English. And then the Tier 3 words are those words that are specific to academics that you probably would only use in this one environment. Those are oftentimes the academic vocabulary that is the focus of our lesson. Being able to discern the vocabulary that you're using and what level the students are in your classroom, and define Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 vocabulary as needed, and having scaffolds in place for those. Let me show you an example. Alice in Wonderland is my daughter's favorite book. So if I were to be teaching about Alice in Alice in Wonderland. These are some of the Tier 1 words, common English vocabulary words. These are some of the Tier 2 words. You don't usually talk about queens, at least not in our country, or caterpillars. The difference between grins and smiles, you can actually get to similarities there, antonyms and synonyms. And then the Tier 3 words, which are really the whole purpose of the lesson, where we're looking at fantasy, nonsense, the morals of the story. Those are Tier 3 words that all the kids are going to be learning. So I'm going to put some scaffolds in place for all those words. But for those kids who need it, those English language learners, I'm going to have scaffolds in place for some of these words too. Does that make sense? Doable? What do you think? Fist to 5. Fist, I don't think I can do this. 5, I think this is fairly easy. Okay. Yeah. When you think about it being a student-mediated environment, basically, or a student-focused environment, you're not going to select all of those scaffolds for all of the students. You're going to give them choices so that those students who need more support in terms of vocabulary will use these. They will have these choices to pull from. And those students who really, they're English speakers, they're really focused on the content at that point, they're not struggling with having to learn 2 languages at the same time, there are these choices available for how you might be addressing this particular goal. Okay. The other key thing that I said is that it's about choices, because at some point those English learners are not going to need nor want the supports. And they should have the opportunity to move ahead when they think they're ready and to use the choices that are available for everybody. And sometimes they find too that you're actually surprised that there are some other kids in the class who need these supports that you're putting out for the kids who need additional English support, and you didn't even know it, So that's sort of an example of how you might do that. All right, let's get into how we doing on time. Okay, so good. We got a good amount of time. Great. So, question, how do you actually use UDL? I'm going to show you a 5-minute video of a classroom that is focused on teaching primarily English learners. And I want you to pick ahead of time one of these principles, UDL principles. You've got the guidelines in front of you. Choose which one you want to be looking for as you watch this classroom example. And then afterwards, we're going to have a sort of a breakdown discussion of what you saw. Okay? Now, it's very difficult to find classroom examples of universal design for learning in practice. I've looked for hours. They really don't exist. This teacher is a good teacher. She's using great strategies, but I bet you she doesn't know what UDL is. So the difference between how she planned this lesson and how you might plan your lessons is that you're going to do it with intent. She's doing it by accident, but it's still good. Okay? So.
You are going to be doing a cooperative paragraph.
Ali Nava is having her second graders work on a cooperative paragraph about the text they're studying, Burros Tortillas.
I'm going to assign you either beginning, middle, or an end. And as a group, you guys need to come up with an exemplary sentence about what happened during each part of the story, whatever your part is.
To begin, she breaks the students into small groups and assigns each group a section of the story to summarize.
You are going to discuss with your group, and you're going to write the same sentence. What happened in either, whatever you're assigned, beginning, middle, or end. And when you're done, we're going to come back and share those out. Does everyone understand that? I don't want to see you just sitting down and starting writing away. You got to talk to each other to see what you're going to put.
The students then discuss the story and come up with a summary sentence together. As extra guidance, Ms. Nava lets the students reference story flashcards and their previous summary worksheets.
So we should write in the square, the poodle didn't share with the bobcat, jackrabbit, and coyote.
Once the groups have their summary statements ready, Ms. Nava brings everyone together so they can share their work.
I want you to share with me the sentences that you came up with in the little rectangle part. It should be the same sentence. You guys agreed upon it. And each of you, each group was assigned either beginning, middle, or end. So raise your hand if you were assigned the beginning part. Brooklyn was, who else? Isabella, Ton? Okay, Brooklyn, share your sentence, please. I'm going to put number 1, and we're going to start right here. So Brooklyn, you're going to share with everybody what your group came up with for the first part, okay? What is the sentence you came up with?
Our groups did, he found corn to make tortillas.
An exercise like this gives English language learners a low-pressure situation in which to practice their language skills. They interact with their peers orally, write with the assistance of classmates, and then have the option of sharing that work with the whole class.
So now, can we read this sentence? Can you read it for me, please?
He found corn to make tortillas.
Does this look okay to you?
No.
No? Why?
Oh, no punctuation.
Oh, somebody needs to raise their hand. Are there mistakes? Did I make some mistakes? Okay.
Ms. Nava intentionally makes errors while writing the sentences so that she can ask the students to spot the mistakes and make the corrections.
Okay, Brooklyn, correct the first mistake. So what did you do?
I capitalized the H because it can be a lowercase if you're starting a new sentence.
How do we start a sentence?
Capital
letters, capital letters. Start a sentence every time. Capital letters, capital letters. It's the first word all the time. Awesome. So why don't you call on somebody else to find another mistake?
This exercise gives the students an engaging way to demonstrate their understanding of the standard conventions of English spelling, capitalization, and punctuation, all of which they need to know in order to meet an important common core milestone.
There's supposed to be a period at the end.
She caught the punctuation. Did you guys see that? Yeah. Did you see that? Okay, let's look at our sentence. Eula, read it again.
He found corn to make tortillas.
Okay. Who else was in the beginning? Ton, can you come up and share your sentence, please?
He saw the corn and said tortillas.
He saw the corn and said tortillas. Okay, Ton, will you read the sentence to the class, please?
He saw the corn and said tortillas.
Ton, what do you notice about the sentence that I wrote? Does it look pretty good to you? No?
There's mistakes.
There's mistakes. Do you want to change one? You want to go first? And then everybody else be studying that sentence to see if you can identify any other mistakes.
This one was wrong. You made a mistake. S-A-I-D.
Raise your hand if you agree with him.
That's right.
Was that a mistake?
Yeah.
What did I do? What did I do, Angelo?
You said wrong.
I misspelled it. You know what I noticed you were doing? You were doing something that good readers do all the time. You kept turning around to look at the word wall. Were you looking for the word said? And what were you doing? You were checking to see if what?
If it was right or
If it was right or wrong. Wow, kiss your brain once. Great learning, great reader. Thank you for catching that.
All right. So what are some of the things that you saw in terms of the principle that you were looking for? Right. And she was very clear about her directions. She maintained their interest the whole time. Yep, using their names, right, definitely. And what about stress in the room in terms of engagement? Very low. Would you agree? Yeah. Why was that? She was very positive,
They were
Well,
working together.
They were working together so that they could share, you know, in terms of this one's got great skills, this one's not so great, so work together and you come up with a good product. What else? Yeah. Perfect. In fact, by showing that she made mistakes, she was making that environment a welcoming environment, a place where they could make mistakes. And it's okay, we'll fix them. Not a big deal. That's really important with our English language learners, frankly, that they oftentimes feel that they have to be perfect. And you know what we end up doing because we interrupt them and we stop them and, oh, no, say that, you forgot your S, you know, say that again, don't, now you didn't say that right, say that word this way. We create stutterers because we don't allow them to finish their thought and we expect them to be perfect in what they produce. It's better, frankly, pick one thing. If they're working on plural S, then just correct plural S. And don't stop them for every single error that they make, particularly when they're at those first beginning 3, maybe even 4 stages. What else did you see? That's great, thank you. What else besides engagement? Right, right. There was another thing that she did in addition with representation. You might not have caught it. At the very beginning when they were sitting together and she was asking them to, yes, go ahead.
They had the pictures.
They had the picture. So even if they couldn't remember or they didn't know the language well enough to be able to say, remember that part at the beginning where he did this? That's a lot. They could just pick up the picture and say, you know, this is the one I think we ought to say. Let's talk about that one. So that by giving the pictures as an additional scaffold, she was supporting those kids who had less language than the others. So representation for sure. How about strategic networks, her action and expression? Yeah, absolutely, and she provided multiple options for that. There wasn't a lot of technology. I mean, this was a basic. A lot of times people think UDL is all about apps and technology, and certainly that helps, but that's not what it's all about. It's a piece. But the other thing about the strategic networks is that she very clearly laid out their plan. You're going to do this, then you're going to do that, and she was, you know, using her body, her whole body, to express the directions that she wanted them to follow. And it was very clear with the little capital letters song that they sang, that she was using call and response and choral singing in a way to provide them with additional scaffolds for learning some tough rules that we have in English. Any other thoughts on that? And this is a teacher who probably doesn't know that she's implementing strategies that are fully aligned with UDL. Here are some things that I picked out. The other piece with the culturally responsive piece is the books that she chose to use. They were books that were relevant to these kids. Talking about tortillas, I would imagine that most of those kids had had a tortilla at some point in time. Now, if you had talked to me as I was growing up about tortillas, I wouldn't have had a clue. I was very unprivileged with that particular content. But these kids, they know tortillas. They know what a burro is. This is language that is actually, from the book, quite culturally related. And in addition, there were a number of other strategies. She allowed them to use their first language with their peers. Let's see what else she did. She didn't actually use any translated, but it certainly sounded like she could have. It sounded like she probably is a pretty fluent Spanish speaker. Oh yes, that's right. It's kind of a, yeah, right. Yeah, a culturally familiar tune. Right, great. Okay, so I will come back to this so that you can copy some of it if you like. I'm just going to move on to the summary and ask you to start working on your exit tickets so that we can decide who's going to win a book. Okay, but this is a quick summary. Make sure you're addressing both language as well as academic goals, that You define culturally responsive learning goals where you consider how, make sure that your goals are not biased and the content is not presented in a biased way. Even an unconscious kind of bias can create barriers for students. Plan for their variability. Offer the tiered vocabulary for them so that they can go up the ladder of language growth in a scaffolded way, and make sure you utilize student choice scaffolds and use of first language. Okay. Did you achieve your personal learning goals? Yes, I hope so. There are a number of other kinds of resources, particularly online, that will provide you with, think about pictorial representations, thinking about the representation piece in a way that where you're almost having to provide pictures and real examples and real items for them so that they can make the connections between the new vocabulary and whatever they had before. The other thing that's really important to teach English learners is the parts of language that we take for granted as adults in English, the suffixes and the prefixes and those kinds of, or basic words that you add a couple of different kinds of endings to, and yet they can mean different things, Those kinds of rules are really important because they can rely on those rules to decode. To decode the new vocabulary in a way that makes it a little bit more supportive. Do I have your exit ticket? I do? Okay. All right. I'm going to let you pick. Did you put yours in?
I was going to say if I win, I'm not waiting. I didn't win. Sheila Hobbs.
Sheila, there you go. Yay. Okay. Well, there it is. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. Good luck with your work.